The Unmarked by Matt Fleagle. Chapter 17. Wounds. The tired party trudged on through miles of disorienting woods, stopping only twice to scrounge scarce nuts from bushes as Glista directed them. The fugitives spoke little as the hours wore on. Kaleb looked over at Madge. She had long since dismounted from Grimwit's furry back. Shuffling along the trail, the girl rarely looked up. Madge's matted and roughly chopped blonde hair stuck to her forehead just above her eyes. Kaleb watched her lips part now and again wordlessly, as though she were talking herself through a silent riddle. Freylin's death had rattled her. "How much farther until we stop?" Grimwit panted. "Not too much farther," Glista said. The scout stopped and shielded her face from the sun that pricked the canopy of trees over them. Her eyes searched the blue-gray sky before she walked on. Kaleb hung back from the others, keeping pace with Madge. Though she moved slowly, the girl seemed adept at avoiding the obstacles presented by the dense foliage. Musing about this to himself, Kaleb suddenly recalled Madge's frequent trips through the deep woods to visit her mother. Every few minutes, Madge reached her trembling hand back to touch the uncovered skin at the base of her neck. "Madge," Kaleb finally said, "I'm sorry about your father. Freylin proved his bravery back at the gate. I saw everything." "Thank you, Kaleb," she said. "But it makes no difference." It does." "To who, Kaleb?" He could not answer. "If the Dellbloods discover that I am a half-breed," she went on, "I will be tossed out of Glenwood, or killed. Don't you understand?" "They will let you live," Kaleb replied. "The Dellbloods are not as cold or as unforgiving as Stonerenders. Besides, who will tell them about the second mark? You know I will say nothing of it." "Weren't you paying attention an hour ago?" Kaleb said nothing. Madge shook her head and frowned. "Kaleb, you've spent most of your life in the woods, among the trees. Your life was hard, but simple. Beautifully simple. You no doubt understand that men are men, whatever their names or cities. One day our people will know, as the Stonerenders now do, that there is a half-breed walking among them. When I am found out, I will not be tolerated in Glenwood Village any longer, just like my mother." That isn't true," said Kaleb. "You are too beautiful for them to discipline or exile." At this she shook her head. "Your sentiment is appreciated, but that will not make any difference either." "But you are prized by the Dellblood elders," he continued. "An omen of luck since your earliest days. The town will not forsake you now, even if the Stonerenders tell them about your parents." She smiled and shook her head again. "I am a novelty to them, just as you are, Kaleb. Their loyalty extends only so far as their superstitions." Kaleb reached up and ran his fingers across his own forehead. As he did, something occurred to him. For 2 terrifying but glorious days, the lack of a mark had not defined him. It had only been mentioned by Amber in the woods. But with Glenwood Village ahead of him, the weight of Kaleb's unmarking sank into his gut again. "Everything will change now," Madge said. "Perhaps," Kaleb replied. "But things do not have to get worse. If the Dellbloods do not accept you back, then you can live with me, Madge." As soon as he said this, Kaleb was surprised by a warm flush that rose into his cheeks. Madge stopped in her tracks and smiled at him. "Kaleb, you are kind. I have known that since I first saw it in your eyes many years ago." Kaleb returned her smile. "But you forget," she continued, "that the Dellbloods have issued an order against you, an order specifying that if Kaleb Dellblood shows his face anywhere near Glenwood, he is to be tried as a traitor. The elders still think you aided the Stonerenders in stealing their branch. If you go back there now, back to our village, you will likely be killed." Kaleb shrugged, though his eyes widened a little with renewed apprehension. "That doesn't matter. We can live in Terrashine. Our people, even Glenward's elders, they cannot harm us there. You can come with me. We will be safe with the warden behind the animal's rock wall." "With whom? What are you talking about, Kaleb?" But just then Glista shushed them all with a sharp whistle and raised her right fist, as Freylin had done before, to signal that everyone should stop in their tracks. All were hushed and stood still, waiting for further instructions from the scout. Glista peered closely into a stretch of dense woods to their left. Kaleb crept forward to where Glista was standing. Teva followed him and stood near Glista's right side. They each followed the scout's gaze through a wide nest of tangled branches into a distant cluster of trees. Neither of them saw anything to alarm them. No movement in the trees. "What is it you see?" whispered Kaleb. "I thought I saw something large moving between those trees," she replied. "And brightly colored, but now I cannot find it, no matter how hard I look. It must have been nothing." "Still, shouldn't we send someone to look?" said Teva. "Just to make sure? I will go." "No, we should definitely stay together," warned Kaleb. "We are almost out of the thickest woods. Soon we will reach the forest outside Terrashine, if I'm not mistaken." Glista nodded. "Yes, but let's build our camp here." She pointed to a spot off to their right. "There, 40 yards to the east, between those two tall trees. They will provide us safety and shelter from any rain tonight. I can post myself in the tops of the trees after dark to keep an eye out for our pursuers." Teva nodded and trotted off to relay Glista's instructions to Grimwit. The bear muttered, "About time," through a loud yawn. Then he galloped toward the small clearing under the two large trees and dropped to the ground, rolling back and forth in the shallow grasses and stretching out his hulking limbs. "Ah, that feels better," Grimwit said. "Madge, go rest your feet for a while," said Kaleb. The blonde girl had sat down upon a fallen log and was pounding her sandals against the bark to clean off any loose dirt and leaves. "I'll set out for more nuts to make a meal of tonight," said Kaleb. "Perhaps I'll see an orchid fruit or two," he added with a smile, "now that we're getting closer to home." Madge joined the two beasts in the clearing. As soon as she was out of earshot, Glista grabbed Kaleb's right arm. She pulled him close. "I was lying before about what I saw in the woods," she said. "What?" "There is something following us, and it's not a detachment of scouts," she said. "I don't think it's human." Kaleb glanced at the woods to their left. As before, he saw nothing. You must be imagining it. Teva and I looked. I think your tired eyes are deceiving you." Glista shook her head firmly. Short hair dangled in uneven black tangles near the base of her skull. Kaleb noticed that a harsh look, not quite anger, but more like sadness, mixed in with fear, had come into her eyes. Glista spoke to him in a low voice. "Don't let your relief at escaping Ablerin dull your senses, Kaleb. We are not clear of danger. Not in the slightest." "Don't you think I know that, Glista?" snapped Kaleb back at her. "My heart is still pounding in my chest from our battle with the Stonerenders back at the West Gate. But we have to be far ahead of your people now. We can rest our eyes, and our feet at least, in these woods. That is until morning light." Glista pointed toward the large cluster of trees to their left. "It will only take a few minutes. Fan out opposite of me and take a look around that patch of trees to the north. Keep your axe out. I'll take a look at the other end to be sure there's nothing watching us." "Fine," Kaleb said. "But when we've finished, we'll agree to set our weapons down and rest for the night." Glista nodded. "I will agree to sheath my sword, Dellblood, but in times like these, no one should be less than an arm's length from a weapon. Kaleb excused himself to the others on the pretense of searching for nuts and fruits. Then he set out toward the cluster of trees that had spooked Glista. His axe outstretched before him, Kaleb eased forward carefully through a close grove of trees to the north of their camp. For some time he found nothing but more thick brush in this stretch of forest. It became harder and harder for his axe to clear the branches ahead. Kaleb stopped to stretch the taut muscles in his back. He noticed the first streaks of starlight in the pale blue sky. He looked back. Kaleb could no longer see his companions in the clearing, nor Glista, who had left to survey the opposite end of the broad copse of trees. Finally, Kaleb leaned against one of the wide tree trunks. He set the head of his axe between his legs and slid to the ground in order to rest his tired feet. Kaleb closed his eyes. The dark green of this forest faded before him, and a brightly lit grove of tilbury trees suddenly filled his mind. Kaleb wiped his forehead and began to long for a night in his shack on the outskirts of Glenwood Village. Since he had left Glenwood, Kaleb had known exhaustion, fear, and hunger such as he had never felt while felling tilbury trees for the Dellbloods. With his eyes closed, Kaleb could almost smell the earthy scent of Greenwich wood in his nostrils. He could feel the delicious sensation of lying upon a supple bed of yellow flowers while resting from his work on a cool afternoon, a good mile from the bustling, chattering noises that filled the village square. Back there, among the tilbury trees, Kaleb had been alone and safe. Back then, Kaleb knew nothing of beasts and wardens, of sword-wielding scouts and enchanted branches. All he knew back then were the smells and sounds, and the sight of the lovely tilbury trees. Kaleb felt a strange, cold sensation and opened his dozing eyes. A thick mist was gathering off to his right. A moment later, he heard the sound he had longed for since the late hours of last night, a night that felt like a decade ago. It was the heart-wrenching but alluring music that sounded almost like a singing voice. It was the entrancing sound that had led him through the deep woods of Ablerin to Amber's shack and Freylin. Freylin. Kaleb choked back a curious pain in his throat and pushed the memory of Freylin out of his mind. He raised his axe to his shoulder again, rose, and stepped cautiously toward the music. The music led him about 30 yards east toward another small clearing ringed with large, heavily leaved tree trunks. It was impossible to see into this dark clearing without passing between the trees that encircled it. Standing at its border, Kaleb then noticed a second sound mixed in with the sweet music. The noise reminded him of a child's whimper, only deeper, shriller. It was like the noise of tree branches whipped up in a heavy wind. The cry was not that of a man nor a woman. Kaleb took a deep breath. The noise was just on the other side of the trees. The log splitter hesitated. He considered whether it might be wise to summon Glista and the others before charging into possible danger. But something about the music compelled Kaleb forward against caution. He would not risk losing a chance to hear the music again, simply to allay uncertain fears. Kaleb pulled several large boughs apart to create space for his legs to pass through the tangled web of foliage before him. He took a moment to slide his axe under his belt. Free to grip the rugged branches with both hands, Kaleb edged his body into the clearing. Almost through the gap, Kaleb tripped clumsily over a black branch under his boots. He stumbled into a wide patch of earth that stretched open before him about 25 feet long and wide. When he rose from the ground, Kaleb discovered that the mist here was even thicker than it was outside of the clearing. Suddenly, he caught his breath at the sight before him. Through the mist, Kaleb could now see a giant creature curled up in a taut circle on the bare ground only a few yards from where he stood. The mellow moonlight turned the animal's brilliant orange fur to a sallow gray. Veiled in thick mist and whimpering as though in great distress, the dragon that had descended upon Ablerin lay before Kaleb.